Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Stephen Pinecker, and I'm very excited to have a special guest on who's a familiar face. But before I do that, I want to do a little housekeeping. I want to remind my audience that our merch store is open. So go to MormonBookReviews.com and you can get some really cool swag. I guess it's swag if I give it to you. So if you buy it, it's just merch, right? But you can get some we're expanding our inventory of different items that you can get, including phone cases and mouse pads and water bottles, you name it. Hoodies, I just sold a hoodie the other day, so really exciting. And I also want to remind my audience that I'm doing the book giveaway of the two Jonathan Neville books that I have duplicates of, Infinite Goodness and Moroni's America. All that I ask that you do is, first of all, these entries have to be in by May 31st of 2022. And I would like for you to send me an email to mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. I want you to have in the subject line, book contest, and I want your name and your address. Now, I will be at the Mormon History Association in June. So if you're going to be there and you're one of the winners, I can just hand it to you, or I'll send it to you in the mail. Either way, the drawing will be done after May 31st to get those entries in. Thomas Murphy, Dr. Thomas Murphy, anthropologist. We had a real blockbuster episode when you did your response to Rod Meldrum. And, it was really cool because you reached out to me initially as well to tell your story about your interactions with evangelicals. And you wanted to come on my program and do that. And I want to thank you so much for doing that. And you can go on any number of podcasts. And it really means a lot to me that you want to come to me and tell these stories. And that's really cool. I just think it's a real privilege to have you on. And so you reached out to me recently because, of course, we have Under the Banner of Heaven, the limited series on Hulu produced by FX. And you felt that this was, it really started getting you to contemplate about your background and things that happened in your life. And you decided this is the time to have that conversation. And so Thomas, you're here to tell your story. And one of the quotes you have is "just a domestic," which you took out of one of the episodes of Under the Banner of Heaven, an invitation to retrospection on violence and humanity. Thomas, welcome to the program, and I'm excited to hear your story.
Well, Steve, thank you for welcoming me back. I reached out to you because a lot of people have been asking me my opinion about Under the Banner of Heaven. That happened back when the book came out. I think about 2004, 2005. A lot at that time, and it happened a lot recently with the Hulu series. And I thought about writing out my response. And I just thought, no, I think it'd be better just to tell it in an interview. And I recalled the dynamic that we had before. And I thought as I was thinking about possible places to tell it, you announced that you were going to do a series on Under the Banner of Heaven. And so I thought, oh, well, there we go. That tells me where I ought to go. And so I'm delighted to be here. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Coast Salish nations of Western Washington. And I teach anthropology at Edmonds College and just north of the Seattle area.
So one thing I wanted to say is that I just received this book in the mail yesterday from the University of Illinois Press. I want to thank them for rushing this to me to make sure that we had this in time for the interview. And this morning, and the reason why I got this book was Thomas recommended it because you wrote a chapter in this book called Revising Eternity, 27 Latter-day Saint Men Reflect on Modern Relationships, edited by Holly Welker, and Patrick Hugh Mason wrote the foreword. And then we were off camera talking about how you don't really hear men's voices talking about these kind of stories, marriage and relationships. And man, I'll tell you, I read the chapter this morning. I was really blown away by your story. So I got a preview of what we're going to be talking about. So I would encourage people, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for you to purchase this book from the University of Illinois Press. I strongly recommend it. I read some of the titles of some of the other articles I've written. I think just about men, but also women will find these stories compelling and interesting. All right, Thomas.
Yeah, and I'll say that a bit that I'm going to share is in here as well. But there were parts that we had space limitations, and I had to cut a significant amount of what I'd originally written that talked about my childhood abuse. And the child abuse I experienced as a kid. And so that got reduced significantly in that published version. And the published version focuses mostly on my relationship with my wife. And in a sense, we kind of ran away from abusive childhoods together. And it focuses on our relationship of healing from that. And so I think it's a good complement to the story that I'm going to tell today that explores domestic violence in Mormon homes, child abuse specifically, but also murder in my family. And one of the reasons that I hesitate just to give a quick response when somebody asks me, well, what do you think about Under the Banner of Heaven? Is because it hits home. It hits home in a way that is deeply personal and difficult to talk about. So I'm going to do my best. But before I get into my personal story, I did want to start with some general observations about Under the Banner of Heaven. And I don't see this as a literary critique. You've had a little bit of that with Rebecca Biblioteca and with Jim Bennett, and they've offered some insightful critiques, and I want to offer more concise overview. For one, I think both the book and the Hulu series invite readers and viewers to examine the cultural roots of violence in our communities. And I think that's a great opportunity for us to really stop and think about, why do people kill each other? Why do we harm each other? And why do we do it sometimes anyway, in the name of religion? What is the connection between religion and violence? And that's, often a critique that's put forward of the book and series is that John Krakauer maybe exaggerates or over does the connection between violence and religion. And I think the critics also exaggerate his argument. So, I think, it's been years since I read his book, and I did not reread it for this interview, but I have been watching the Hulu series. I will note I gave away my book collection, my Mormon book collection, at a certain point when I gave up Mormon studies in 2008, and I donated all my books, and that was one of the ones I donated, and I haven't repurchased it. So I decided much later, almost a decade later, not quite, 2014, I think is when I really started doing Mormon studies again. And I hadn't been active in it for almost a decade at that point. And then I have had to rebuild my library. So my recollection of the book when I read it back when it first came out is that some of these critiques of Krakauer and violence overstate his argument, and that he does draw and talk about some difficult issues in Mormon history that have a violent component, and we see that effort through the flashbacks in the Hulu series to try to bring that in. I think it's more challenging in the film than in the book to do that. And when I see this film that Dustin Lance Black has put together as the screenwriter, I'm excited to see what I call an uncorrelated account of Mormon history, or a particular incident in Mormon history and some related episodes. And what I mean by uncorrelated is that in the 1960s, the LDS Church, implemented a rigorous program of review of its curriculum and materials that was very authoritarian and reduced the variety of voices and tried to, kind of to franchise Mormonism, to make it more like McDonald's than a church, and than a religion. And so in that effort to correlate our religion, we get the result that you can go to an LDS chapel anywhere in the world and it's going to look familiar. Okay. And I think that was their corporate mentality that they were trying to achieve to create a McMormonism. And that has some benefits, in terms of the structure and organization and adapting the church to a global environment. I understand some of the reasons that they would do it, but one of the downsides of the correlation is that the diverse voices from within the faith tradition are silenced. And so here we've got Dustin Lance Black bringing forth a story of his, and I think it's important to see that he plays a significant role in the fictionalized aspects of the Brenda Lafferty murder that is at the center of this, and her child's murder that's at the center of the spoken series. Another aspect that I really like about the series in particular is the influence of Lindsay Hansen Park and Troy Williams, who are both good friends of mine. And they show that there's more than one way to Mormon. And that's a theme that Lindsay Hansen Park in her work with Sunstone really emphasizes. Sunstone's a symposium that's held in different regions. There's an annual one in Salt Lake that I'll be at this summer in the end of July. And hope to see you and maybe some other listeners there. And so Lindsay Hansen Park's kind of theme of more than one way to Mormon really comes out in this series, in that you don't get just a single portrait of Mormons as murderers, which, Ron and Dan Lafferty certainly fit into that. But you see a spectrum of people. You see Brenda Lafferty's faithful perspective and progressive to some extent, at least in relationship to the rest of the Lafferty family. And so you see that tension within LDS families portrayed and showing that there's more than one way to Mormon, right? And so I really think that's a real strength of the series. I will say that especially that first episode just kind of hit me a little bit hard on the kitschiness of it, that it was almost overdone in its idiosyncrasies of what it is to be Mormon. Although I have to say, everything like talking about Heavenly Father all the time, or calling people brother and sister, having to pray about major decisions, those are all familiar to me, right? Okay, I recognize them as being Mormon, so I can't say no, but it was an overload of that in that first episode. But I think as it's moved on, it doesn't feel as disjointed. But I have to say those are markers of Mormonism.
I just as a side note, I just had a quick question. Are you glad that they made a point to have a Native American deputy in the series? Talk about maybe that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I do think that, he's represented, and I believe that character is fictional, right? But as along with Jeb Pyrie, they're both fictional characters, but it enabled them to provide a Native American perspective. And because Native people are such an important part of the Mormon story, particularly the Book of Mormon story, I think that's a great way to bring in some of these issues. And I really think that's what Dustin Lance Black is trying to do. He's trying to tell a story of a faith crisis. And so what you get that is layered on top of the story of Brenda Lafferty's murders. And, so it's similar to, in the sense that John Krakauer was trying to respond to 9/11, to the attack on the Twin Towers by Muslim extremists, by exploring extremism and religion. And so John Krakauer layered that on top of the Lafferty family story. And then Dustin Lance Black is layering his own faith crisis on to this story as well. And I think it's important to see them as multiple stories and to recognize that this is not Brenda Lafferty's story. And I think Sharon Weeks, who is Brenda's sister, just wrote this incredibly powerful editorial that's in the Deseret News about how this isn't the story of her sister. And I was deeply moved by that. I really think that people need to keep that in mind. as a critique, but also as just a way to watch it and to recognize that the multiple stories that are at play, and that there's more to the story than is told, even though there is some breadth to it. It's not all there.
I've reached out to Sharon, and she's expressed interest in coming on the program to tell Brenda's story and also her story. So hopefully down the road, we'll be able to we'll be able to honor Brenda and her daughter.
I would love to see that episode. And I just want to say publicly to her, thank you for telling your story, and for the work that she's done. She's been quite active in opposing the death penalty, which is quite interesting given this whole setting. But when I approached the book, I found some interesting things, because so the book was written as a response to 9/11. As I said, that story of the Twin Towers is kind of layered onto the way that John Krakauer tells the Lafferty murder story. And there were some interesting connections between the way John Krakauer responded and the way I responded. So I was a new faculty member at Edmonds Community College, as it was called at the time. And I had just, I had just helped organize a big lecture on campus of bringing Sherman Alexie to our campus. And in the aftermath of 9/11, people started turning to me to organize some events. And in fact, I became an important part of my job to run a lecture series in the next few years. And so I organized a campus lecture series to address and help the community respond to 9/11. And there are both some similarities in what I did and some differences in what John Krakauer did that I think are worth noting. In my approaches, I wanted our community to recognize that Muslims who fly planes into buildings are only even a fringe element of Islam. And so I worked very closely with Muslim communities locally to bring representatives to campus to tell their stories in their own words. And not just representatives of Islam, but of Judaism and Christianity. And then I diversified, including Hinduism, Mormonism, indigenous religions, and asking people to talk about their stories of peace and violence and to get some complexity. And John Krakauer, on the other hand, gives an outsider's view of Mormonism. Okay, so where Dustin Lance Black and Lindsay Hansen Park and Troy Williams are providing very much an insider perspective, Krakauer's was an outsider's perspective, although I think he was careful in his research and tried to be fair, but he also looked at it from his outsider perspective. And so I didn't want to ignore outsider perspectives, and I also brought into the lecture series experts in international relations and in politics, and so we had kind of the combination of people's voices and the professional experts. The other thing we did is we put together people on our campus that represented these different groups and put them together on a panel and talked about their experiences. What is it like to be a Muslim on our campus? And because we had local situations of attacks on a mosque, and we had some important things to address. We also had, at the time, I had a student in my class who was from Syria, and her father had been a pilot in the Syrian Air Force, and in fact had flown planes for the president of Syria. And I find out one day that she was picked up by the INS at 6 o'clock in the morning. They broke down to the door in her home and arrested her and her father and her brother. and took them to a detention camp. And members of the Muslim community that I'd been working with, one who would later become a congressional representative, she's currently a congressional representative for Washington, her name's Pramila Jayapal. And she ran an organization called the Hate Free Zone. And I worked with her to lobby on behalf of this family, the Hamawi family that was detained really unjustly, just because they happened to be Muslim and happened to have a pilot in the family. It was a difficult time. So, you know, I just wanted to share a little bit of my experiences with that. The other thing that I did is I developed a special topics course on campus along with several other social scientists on the global roots of terror. And we offered that course to the students to give a chance to earn some credits towards their degree that would allow them a place to process the feelings that they were having and the concerns about being in this time of particular difficulty nationally and internationally. And in my section, I provided the anthropological and the religious studies perspective because that's my training. And we looked at humans as one of the most violent, but also one of the most cooperative animals, you know, kind of from an evolutionary perspective. We are surprisingly violent as a species and have committed tremendous acts of destruction on the world and on other species and on ourselves. And that's a part of our story. It's a troubling part of our story. But at the same time, we're also one of the most cooperative. We work together with each other and can do tremendous things, build enormous cities, take care of the poor. We can care and love for each other. Families are just such an important part of our social structure, right? So humans are this fascinating animal with a mixture of violence and compassion and cooperation. And you can actually see that violent component and that cooperative component come together. And the way that I tried to tell that story in that lecture is interestingly very similar to the way that Krakauer approached it. And that is, I keyed in on the coincidence, if you will, that the Mountain Meadows Massacre, at least one of the biggest days of murder, occurred on September 11th, 1857. And so that kind of is eerie on one sense, right? Why is that? But then that was also one of the biggest mass murders in US history before the Oklahoma City bombing, and not counting the slaughter of many Native Americans. I should say one of the biggest murders of white people, although there were some Native people in those Baker and Fancher parties as well. But the Mountain Meadows Massacre is extremely violent, but also strikingly cooperative. Okay, this was an event where the Mormon militia, at a time of conflict with the United States, they call it, the Utah War, there were federal troops on the way to Utah to remove Brigham Young as the governor. And, so the Mormons felt under attack, okay? And they respond by dressing up as Indians and staging a faux attack, and then pretending to negotiate on behalf of the Baker Fancher party a truce with the Southern Paiute Indians, which was really the white people dressed in paint, maybe a couple of Indians, but probably not. I mean, that's a big historical question. Southern Paiutes say they were not participants. There's some historical evidence to suggest there might have been one or two. And those were probably children in Mormon homes that didn't have a lot of choice So anyway, they after this supposed truce, they provide Mormon guards. And I remember hearing about this in seminary when I was a kid that just ate at me. These Mormon guards promise that they will protect the Fancher party, and they disarm them. And then they put a Mormon guard next to the person with a rifle. And then at a certain point, they execute them. This is, if you think about it, it's incredibly violent, but it's also incredibly cooperative. And so it captures that amazing human capacity for cooperation and the repugnant capacity for violence at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so it is an important story for addressing the question. And so both Krakauer and I independently landed on that same story to address this question. And I think it's fair to do that, even though it's difficult. It's a difficult one to do. The other thing I did in that course is I assigned this book, and this is a book I really recommend to your viewers. It's a little older now because this came out in the early 2000s. Abraham on Trial by the anthropologist Carol Delaney at Stanford University. And the subtitle is The Social Legacy of Biblical Myth. And Carol Delaney examines Abraham's, from the Old Testament, his problematic sacrifice of his own child, which is a story at the heart of three religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the idea that God would ask someone to murder their own child is horrific and frightening, and also a powerful way to get our attention, right? If we want a story that's riveting. It's troubling that sacrifice rather than protection of children then becomes a focus of faith. What she argues is that, somehow these stories become utilized as a way of justifying our own violence against children. And in my lectures, I tried to look at it within the context of a cultural evolution too, that, human societies at the time these stories probably originated were shifting from family and kin-centered societies to centralized state-level societies. And these state-level societies that began to form armies, or organized militias, they needed the alliance of people to a centralized authority rather than to their own family and kin. And sometimes that would mean killing your own. And so stories like this emerge not just in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but you can find stories like this in the Bhagavad Gita, in Hinduism, and elsewhere in these religious traditions around the world. And these stories where people are asked to kill their own, that's part of the evolution of human society, and that move from that family-centered to a state-centered society. And Carol Delaney looks at how these stories also naturalize and sacralize, make sacred the patriarchal power, the power of a man. Because why do we assume that Isaac is Abraham's property to begin with?
Right.
Why could he sacrifice? What about Isaac? What say does Isaac have in this story, right? Mm-hmm. That we don't even consider the question.
That's right.
We could look at that story and celebrate the role of the angel who intervenes instead of celebrating Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own child, right? And so there's different ways to look at that story. And
Well, and this is the thing,
They,
Thomas, is that we see the misuse of scripture all the time, that we have stories even to this day of people who are told by God to kill their children. And this is, and this is an ongoing thing that happens. And also, or kill their child because they're gay, or any number of, or honor killing in the Middle East. And it saturates the Judeo-Christian world and historically, and we still have modern manifestations of it to this day.
Yeah, in fact, Carol Delaney talks about a trial of a father in California who murdered his youngest child in 1990, and kind of, looks at all the press coverage in the trial where he's portrayed as a madman, right? Rather than a revered patriarchal figure. And the other thing that is important coming out of that book is the role between men and women. So in the biblical narratives, you get this concept of seed, and this concept carries over into the Book of Mormon as well. And this concept of a seed as the patriarchal contribution to life, that men plant a seed in the womb of a woman, and it's the man's seed that produces that child. That undervalues the contribution of women to the reproductive process. Women provide, they didn't understand at the time, right? They didn't understand DNA or the biology of sperms and eggs, and but we know today that the men contribute the sperm and women contribute the egg, and that half of your chromosomes come from your mother and half come from your father.
Yeah, the men provide the fertilizer, which makes for a completely different way of biology, which tells me, folks, don't take these scriptures too literally, because it gets that wrong. The man is the fertilizer.
Yeah, and so and women, of course, provide the safe place for the life to emerge, right? So they don't just provide half of the genetic endowment; they provide that place. And so that patriarchal kind of way of thinking undervalues women's contribution as well. So that's how I had approached this, and I bring this up as kind of as an alternative way and as a complementary way to look at under the banner of heaven and religious narratives. And if it's all right now, I'd like to transition to my own childhood and violence in my faith journey.
Absolutely. And I read your chapter, and then of course you sent me some information to kind of peruse beforehand. And I want to thank you for coming on and sharing this story, because I know this is you've had a very tough life, very difficult childhood, and you just tell your story, Thomas.
Yeah. Well, my earliest years were not characterized by violence. And so that gave me kind of a perspective when things started to change. But I mean, in my early years, my parents were, they did spank us occasionally or swat us. So there was some physical violence, but it was never done with the intent of hurting the child. That it was more of correcting or a child, or redirecting, or getting your attention, that sort of thing. And not what I would experience later in terms of the brutality. And I think it's important to, kind of provide a little bit of setting for my childhood. My mother and father were both from Southern Idaho, but they moved to California shortly before I was born. And so I was born in Southern California, but then we moved back to Idaho when I was very young, before my memories started, about a year and a half, and then lived on a farm outside of Burley, Idaho, along the Snake River. And so those early years were on the farm, and my mother is a descendant of Mormon pioneers going way, 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 way back. She converted my father to Mormonism. So he joined at her encouragement. Okay, but his background is largely Protestant evangelical background, We talked a little bit about my relatives on my father's side in our first interview, and the kind of that evangelical component of my family that was an important part of my growing up. And for my father and mother at that time, church was a social thing. I mean, I think they were believers, but I don't think they were not dogmatic. Attendance was irregular. And of course, part of that was living on a dairy farm, okay? Because at a dairy farm, the cows produce their milk, and you have a set schedule you've got to work with, and that schedule often conflicted with church meetings. And in those days, this is in the 70s, we didn't go to church in a 3 or 2 hour block. We went to church in the morning, we had Sunday school and priesthood in the morning, and then we had sacrament meeting in the afternoon. And so, our attendance was sporadic at best, and my dad's priorities too. I mean, he would rather go water skiing in between that. When he'd take a day off on Sunday, he wouldn't work, he'd go water skiing instead, and he'd go with the bishop. And then the bishop would go to sacrament meeting later. Sometimes we would go, so there was a very different approach to religion than I would get later. It was very casual approach to religion and very socially oriented. But things would change in 1974 when my parents divorced. And on both sides, actually, my mother and father, church attendance would increase after that. And both of them would marry people who were more devout in the church, or more committed to, dogmatic in their religious perspectives. I would live with, most of the time, with my mother and stepfather, and we would visit my father on holidays and in the summers for a few weeks at a time. But my childhood was really in relationship to my mother and my stepfather.
If you don't mind me asking, what was the cause of the divorce?
Well, infidelity.
Okay.
My mother hooked up with the home teacher.
Okay.
And I think that might have been part of it. My dad's casual approach to the church versus somebody who was more committed. I think he made promises to her that he did not follow through on. And I didn't know this at the time, I should say. I only found out several years later, because at the time we'd asked my dad that question. We'd asked him, why did you leave? Because we saw it as him leaving, right? And he said, I can't tell you now, but I'll tell you when you're older. And he told us when I was around 12. My mother told us a couple of years later, and confessed what she had done, and deeply apologized, but both my parents are passed, so that's why I went ahead and answered that question.
Well, thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, but that's a difficult reason, and again, it's not something I was aware of at the time, or till a few years later. So I was 7 years old at the time.
Okay.
And my mother, both of them actually ended up in new relationships pretty quickly. That situation with the home teacher did not pan out like they had imagined. They usually don't, so my mother met my stepfather, Bill Bean, at church. And he at the time was wearing a cast on his leg. And she said that him in a cast and crutches made her feel safe with him, which, was actually not what we would experience. Safety and security was lost in that moment of her making that choice. And they rushed into a marriage. And I think she still had to wait for a temple divorce before she could marry in the temple. So they had a civil wedding, and then later sealed in the temple. And my stepfather, Bill, brought into our home really strong anti-government attitudes. He was also a convert, like my father, and a relatively new convert at the time. And so I don't mean to suggest that all of these attitudes that he had were formed by Mormonism, although they made Mormonism attractive to him and a particular brand of Mormonism attractive to him. And so he had this strong resistance to government and to authority. And I think part of that was rooted in his father, who was a chiropractor. And, you know, chiropractors and the medical association have a long, torturous relationship. As the United States and, you know, around the world and other countries as well, as medical professions specialized or professionalized, chiropractors found themselves more on the outs of things in kind of institutionalized medicine in the United States. And so there was an anti-government attitude among many chiropractors. That they resented regulation, especially of medicine. And there is some, I will say, knowing a little bit about medical anthropology these days, that there is a monopolization of medical practice that occurred, and that was in some senses problematic. So there's some legitimacy to some of their concerns, but there were also, on the part of the state, was a desire to protect people and protect people from quack medicine. And some of the practices of chiropractics did not stand up to rigorous scientific review. And so that was, you know, part of that tension. And so ironically, while he had this distrust of medical establishment, he worked in a hospital. And he was a kind of custodian, later maintenance supervisor. So you can, in a hospital setting in Burley and then later in Pocatello. And so while he's doesn't trust the medical establishment, that's where he works. And so he's both dependent upon them. And I think that's part of that resentment, right? You're in that situation where you can see what you see as problems with the medical establishment, yet you're stuck with it and you're part of the system that you despise. And for him, that involved, you know, preferring herbs over medicines. It didn't mean never going to the hospital. I mean, I had my appendix removed at 10 years old and went to the hospital where he worked and had it done. And, you know, I mean, you know, it wasn't a point, it wasn't that extreme. Okay. But, you know, let's say taking care of a cold, or even when he had pneumonia, we were using herbs to treat rather than, you know, over-the-counter medicines or prescriptions. And so that was very much a part of my childhood. He'd also had quite a ranting about taxes, so that's also very similar to the Lafferty brothers, but not quite as militant as they were. You know, he paid his taxes, at least as far as I knew. My dad, my biological dad, Roy Murphy, who ran his own businesses, and he had kind of he paid his taxes, but only what he was required to do. And he was very adept at using his businesses and his families to legally avoid paying taxes.
Sure.
And, you know, and so, you know, there was a little bit of that on both sides of the family. But in terms of my stepfather, Bill, it was often framed in a very negative way. The government's trying to take advantage of us. And, you know, and with my dad, it was more of a cooperative relationship with the government. You know, they take care of the streets and, you know, they do good, important things, but I don't want to pay more than I have to, you know. And one of the striking things that my stepfather did when he moved into the house is he threw out the television. He called it the boob tube. That was his term. And he used to say that Satan ran the networks. And back then, it's not like today with TV. There were 3 channels the three main networks. And then if you're lucky in your area, you had PBS too, or local PBS station. And that was it. That's all you had on television. And TV was actually quite a bit more regulated in those days than it is now. So for him, it was a way for the government to get into, and Satan to use the government to get into our heads and into our home, and to kind of penetrate that sanctuary. And so he threw it out. And so I spent most of my childhood without a television. From 7 till 18, we did get, or 17, we did get a TV again when I was 17. So the only television I watched was either at relatives or friends. And I even in sixth grade, I ran a television program for school. We did a public television show in our grade school, and I won best director. And I never even saw my own show because
Wow.
that I won the prize for. But that there's kind of this strange relationship with television. So our television was basically replaced by gun racks, and so those became a very important part of our home.
This is okay. Gun racks is crazy, but do you think there? And I grew up, in the age of television, big time. That was, it was very similar to the age of television in the 50s, where you only had a handful of channels. I remember when we first finally got cable, but overall, do you think it was a good thing or a bad thing that you weren't in front of the boob tube all the time as a child?
At the time, I resented it, because I felt like I was different. I couldn't fit in with my friends. My friends would be talking about these TV shows, and I didn't know anything about them. And I still, I'm really good at trivia, but when I play trivial games like Trivial Pursuit, we used to play all the time, you get to those television show questions and I just bomb, I mean, I'd be good in every other category, but bad in those. So there's some deficits, if you will, as a result of that upbringing. But I learned to love books, and I really turned to reading instead, and that's been a blessing in my life. I really love that. And I still actually don't watch a lot of television. My wife is a very big fan of television, and so sometimes we try to figure that out. What is the right balance? She watches a lot more, and I watch a lot less, and we get along really well that way. And, but I don't judge her for it. I don't think that Satan is getting into her head or anything like that. But that's just her preference, what she grew up with. I grew up reading books, and so I would rather sit on the couch and read a book. And
that's why you were so much better in all those other categories besides TV. It could have been the other way around.
Right. Yeah. And my stepfather also talked often about the end times and about joining a militia. That was always more aspiration than reality. A lot of talk, but not a lot of action. But he really, wanted to be in a militia. He subscribed to like the John Birch Society's magazines, and I used to read those when I was a kid because I was a reader. And I don't know that he read that much himself, but he did admire LeGrand Richards and would talk about Marvelous Work and Wonder, his book, as an important part of his faith journey. He was also a big fan of Ezra Taft Benson, who was a church leader at the time, who he was been in the Eisenhower administration, Secretary of Agriculture, and had some pretty strong John Birch Society type views. And along with him, Cleon Skousen and his different dispensations. And those were important ways that he oriented himself in the world. And so these are the same intellectual influences, if you will, that affect the Lafferty brothers.
Sure. And I just want to real quick too, just remember, I did a 3-part interview with Matt Harris talking about these individuals, in particular Ezra Taft Benson. I recommend you check it out.
I love Matt Harris's work. He really gets this stuff and understands it quite well. A big part of that Mormon childhood was an obsessive food storage. Okay, the church leadership was often encouraging food storage. Well, we took it to an extra level. You're supposed to have 1 year's food storage, and we tried to have more than that. And not just food storage, but only for us, it was only certain types of food because of this criticism of the establishment. We were not allowed to, by my stepfather, to have processed grains, any processed foods, like no white bread. And it was kind of an irony because I couldn't have white bread at home, but we go to church on Sunday, and sacrament, or the Eucharist, what other people would call it, would be white bread and water, but I couldn't eat white bread at home. And, so there's really strong resistance to processed sugar or flour. And we actually ground our own wheat by hand, made our own bread. And we raised and ate rabbits and later goats and chickens, and turned our backyard into a vegetable garden and an orchard, and raising our own food. Those were important parts of that upbringing. He also introduced into the family daily scripture study, and that would usually occur in the mornings before breakfast around the kitchen table. Imagine getting the whole family up. There were 4 of us kids from my mom's marriage, 3 from my stepfather's marriage, so the 7 kids, getting them up and around it ranged in age from, my sister would have been about 4 years old to my stepsister, the oldest, was 17. So this whole range of ages, and getting all of them up around the table to read. And that was what, it was my introduction to the Book of Mormon. And at the time, I really enjoyed it. Enjoyed reading. I enjoyed reading in it. I found the Book of Mormon fascinating. But I also learned, I was really surprised. Here I was 7 years old, and I could read pretty good. I mean, there were words I would encounter in the Book of Mormon that I had to sound out and stuff. But listening to my stepfather and my older stepbrothers, who were teenagers, they couldn't read most of the words. They needed a lot of help. And here I was, a 7-year-old, and I could read far better than they could. And it was also kind of my exposure to, wow, there's a difference. And I later learned from my stepfather, he never read a book cover to cover. And until the Book of Mormon, until we were doing it as a family, but he never sat down himself and read a book cover to cover. He said he almost did it once with Treasure Island when he was in high school. And so it was a very different way of thinking about the world. I was very book oriented and not so much for him. And my mom would emphasize that when we're reading these stories, say of Lehi and Sariah in the Book of Mormon, that we're reading about our own ancestors, because on my mother's side, we had a distant ancestor. I would later learn her name is Susanna Ferguson, who was Mohawk. At the time, I learned that she was an Indian princess or a Lamanite, and that's the way that I learned it. But with the Book of Mormon was more than just a sacred history of the Americans. It was the story of our ancestors that was really emphasized to us for my mother, and that struggle between Nephi and Laman, or Nephi and Sam and Laman and Lemuel, that starts out the Book of Mormon, was really formative in my self-conception. Seeing Laman and Lemuel as wicked and disobedient and cursed with a dark skin, all coming from the Book of Mormon, well, that would get a lot of emphasis in our family discussions. And Nephi and Sam as righteous and obedient and light-skinned. And so that skin color stuff would be emphasized in the way that we read the Book of Mormon, and would play out in this violence in some frightening ways. I also remember reading the story of Nephi's murder of Laban, where it says, better that one man should perish than a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. And that was troubling to me, that story, that idea that God would tell somebody to murder somebody, and or an angel of God would do that. And but that was part of the upbringing, and it would also come back to haunt us in the violence that followed. Another component of our childhood was family home evenings and family councils. And family home evenings were on Monday, and when we got together as a family, other times it's family council, right? And family home evenings were maybe a little more devotional, and family councils were more policy or rules, that sort of thing emphasized. But these became a spectacle of domestic violence and child abuse and racism. And my stepfather would use family councils as a place to beat, especially his teenage children, in front of the full family. We all got our turn. Okay, so we were all beaten, but really the worst abuse was of my two older stepbrothers and of my older brother, who was older than me. They took the brunt of it, and I got enough. I got enough to know I didn't want any more of it. But this abuse was both verbal, so the frequent yelling and screaming to intimidate, and just, to get, as this patriarchal father, to get his way, he would yell and push you around that way, and intimidate you through loud voice. And then he would have these beating spectacles that were brutal. So he would do different things, but sometimes he would remove his belt. So he'd be very dramatic in the way he would remove his belt, kind of to get the emphasis on, look what I'm doing, make himself big and strong. And he'd rip that belt out of his trousers, and then he'd take it and he'd snap it and snap it and snap it in our faces, And then he would, whoever's turn it was to get beat, he'd have him in the middle of the living room and start beating him with that belt. Or sometimes he'd use a stick, he'd make us go out and cut our own sticks.
Wow.
So we'd have to cut our own sticks so that we could be beat with them. And I'd try to figure out which one's going to hurt the least, but he'd call that a switch. And I was like, that was a word I wasn't, I don't use anymore. And I was like, look, because a lot of this, as I was remembering this in the last week or so, as I've been thinking about it, his language keeps coming back to me. And some of it is, boob tube or switch, or some of these other cotton picking, these terms that he used to use. I guess I don't hear them anymore. And I don't,
It's fascinating because in these, Adrian Peterson, who was an NFL football player, he used the term switch, and he had his kids cut down the branch that they were in. He was suspended for the NFL for a while for doing this. So this is all there. This is.
Yeah. And so when he would hit us, it wasn't, when my mom would spank us, it would be on the butt, or my dad. But when my stepfather did it, it would be everywhere from the neck down to your ankles.
Jeez.
And designed to bruise and draw blood. And, and while he's doing this, he would scream at you, I'm going to beat the cotton pick and tar out of you, even if it kills me.
Wow.
Cotton pick and tar out of you.
Was he from the South?
He was from California.
Wow, that's interesting.
But I mean, I don't know where his ancestors, they may have had some Southern influence. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But yeah, there's definitely kind of that language, and very racialized language. Cotton picking was his favorite curse word. And again, I don't ever hear that anymore. I don't know. You live in the South, maybe you hear it there.
Heard it in the Midwest growing up.
Yeah,
but they've become archaic now. Yeah.
Yeah. And, in terms of, you got to understand this in the terms of the Book of Mormon. As I was processing this as a child, here I was reading these stories that Nephi, and by being obedient, he keeps his white skin, and Laman turns dark because he's wicked. And so then, and then my stepfather's talking about cotton pick and tar, beat the cotton pick and tar. I mean, that's beat the black out of you. Okay. That you're not going to become, you're going to stay white. And so there was this kind of fragility of our whiteness. And that might have been, his own unease over my mom having Lamanite ancestors. I don't know for sure. I never heard him express it that way, but it may have been that it may have just been his internal way of orienting the world, and the language that he'd grown up with that was quite racialized. And he would say other things though too that were directly out of the Book of Mormon, like it's better that one child should suffer than a family should dwindle in unbelief, when we're having this family council, and echoing back that Nephi murdering Laban, and using scripture to justify his violence. So when I see Under the Banner of Heaven, I see Ammon Lafferty. Boy, he reminds me of my stepfather, and the way he's beating his children in public. And it really echoes really strongly in my experience. And my stepfather too wouldn't just do this at home. I mean, at home, it's just our family. But beating wasn't just a punishment; it was a spectacle. And I don't quite understand why, but he also made it a public spectacle, like Ammon does in the book. And today, I think if we saw somebody doing to us doing to a child today what was done to us, I would call the police. I mean, it should have been illegal. It probably was illegal even at the time, but nobody did anything that I knew about. And so to give you some examples of what would happen is if we were irreverent, you use that word a lot, at church, he'd drag you by the arm out of the chapel, and then beat you with a belt in the foyer. So everybody in the chapel could see the kid being dragged out, and they could hear the whipping in the foyer and the screams. And I for the life of me, I don't know why somebody didn't do anything about it. Just a domestic, right? That's where that phrase, just a domestic, that point really hit home in that when I'm watching Under the Banner of Heaven, and in episode 4, the banker is talking about, I think it was Dan, he was talking about talking to Dan Lafferty about, and he reveals this letter that Brenda apparently had written on behalf of Matilda, or helped her Matilda write, and who was Dan's wife. And then that had gone to the church president. I've heard that actually happened. Okay. Sharon Weeks could probably clarify that better for you, but I've heard that it did actually happen from Lindsay Hansen Park anyway. And that anyway, in that scene, you get the banker describing it. For one, he's revealing to the patriarch what his wife is doing to almost encourage him to take her into control, right? To control her. And then he's dismissing it to the detective as just a domestic. And I think that attitude was certainly prevalent in my childhood, because today, if I saw that, I'd be calling the police. And I hope most people would. And another example, my brother Steve was riding a bicycle in the street, and we're in the car. He slams on the brakes, and this is before seatbelts. So when you'd slam on the brakes, everybody would smash into the dashboard if they're in the front seat, or the seat in front of you in the station wagon we had. And so everybody would be hurt. as a result of it. And then he jumps out, rips Steve off of the bicycle, and then beat him in front of the entire neighborhood. And again, nobody called the police. In other things, if we were making too much noise in the car, again, he'd slam on the brakes, yank you out of the car, beat you on the side of the street, and oftentimes leave you to walk on your own on the side of the highway, find your own way home. And that's what he would tell you. And so definitely a troubling way to be raised. And this patriarchy that we were learning at church legitimized this type of abuse. And as I think he did treat us as we were property, not as human beings in our own right, with our own feelings and thoughts and desires.
Yeah. Sounds all too familiar, my friend. There's similar things that maybe not as intense with my family, but I am familiar with other Christians within the evangelical world where we had people like this, very similar to your stepfather, and were very patriarchal and did beat their kids. And this is not an uncommon thing.
Well, I will point out, as a social scientist who's looked into this stuff, that religion, being religious, or particular religious affiliations, do not on the large scale show a correspondence with violence. I think it's important to recognize that as a critique in response to Dan Lafferty. However, there are some cases where that is the case. And that case is more conservative and authoritarian religious denominations have a greater incidence of violence. And particularly when there's a difference between the man's religious views and the woman's religious views, and the mother and father, or husband and wife, there tends to be more violence when the male has more dogmatic views. So there are some correlations that show up in the data, and they do center around authoritarian stuff, but religion in general does not make you more violent. But authoritarian religion does correspond with more violence.
Sure. Yep. I
don't know that it causes it. That's a different question. Right. And I think that it correlates with it. And I think it's probably more a justification than a cause.
I think so too. Yep. I think that's why your stepfather was attracted to Mormonism. Yeah.
And some of the things they would do after they got married in the temple or sealed in the temple, they would have date nights. They would go to the temple, and during those times we'd be supervised by our step siblings. Eventually my oldest stepsister Sharon, when she turned 18, my stepfather basically kicked her out of the house. He said, either you pay rent or you leave. She didn't want to pay rent, to him anyway. So she left, and that left me with my older stepbrother Scott and Eugene to be our babysitters. And in my head, Scott and Eugene were like Layman and Lemuel. And I saw them in that kind of way. And their favorite thing to do on those nights was play cops and robbers. And we were always the cops, us younger kids, and they were always the robbers. But this wasn't just a make up, a pretend game. They would actually break into cars and houses, and we were trying to catch them.
Oh my goodness.
And so they would steal things from our neighbors. And it was our job to catch them. And they would threaten us that, if we ever tell, they're going to slit our throat.
Wow.
And so especially Scott was the one that was really strong on that. And, so we'd play these games. And then if we ever got close, we never did catch them, right? And if we got close, they would react violently. And so, for one example, on my patrol, I was patrolling and I came across them. They would throw rocks at us, and they hit me in the back of the head, split my head open, a lot of blood. They made me go in the house, clean it up. Luckily, it stopped bleeding on its own. But they swore if I told that, they were going to slit my throat. And so I never did tell. I still have a scar in the back of my head from that. And Eugene was very quiet, and he was the older of the two, and Scott was the one that was the talker, and he would tell stories to us. He'd gather us together in the living room like a family council, and he would tell us stories about Charles Manson, the Manson murders, and in detail about how the murders occurred. And I don't know where he learned this stuff, but he knew it in detail. And he would also tell these stories about Hell's Angels. Hell's Angels being a motorcycle club at the time. And he would say that they would do things like bring their motorcycles in, knock down the front door and bash in a house, and they'd throw hand grenades in there. And then he'd describe in detail, he'd say, well, if that happened to us, here's what you need to do. And he said, I'm going to jump on that hand grenade and I'm going to save all of you. And, that's how you would handle the hand grenade. And then he would describe in gory detail what would happen to his body as the hand grenade exploded. And just kind of this obsession with violence and gore. He was also quite obsessed with black magic and with pentagrams and that sort of stuff. And he said that his dream was to become a mercenary. That's what he wanted to do for a living. And when I asked, well, how do you become a mercenary? But he says, you got to kill somebody. And he would talk then about how he would kill people. And I'd say, well, if you kill somebody, you're going to go to jail. You can't just kill somebody. And he says, yeah, but murderers don't really go to jail. They go for, 6 years at most. Murderers will go to jail and they get out. Have you ever heard of parole? And all this, he kind of denigrate you. In his head, this was his path to becoming a mercenary, and a professional killer, basically. And he would talk about how nations would hire people to go around the world and kill, and that's what he wanted to do. And then he would talk to us in detail about how to kill people. And he would really emphasize slicing your throat. And in telling those stories, he would say it's really important to go from ear to ear. And now I know Mormons hearing this are going to hear something here that I'm not necessarily implying, because this is the first time I heard these stories. He was a 14-year-old recent convert to the LDS faith. Okay, I don't think he got this from the temple. Okay, but there are temple oaths that are brought up in the film, quite controversial, and in the book, of the slitting of the throat from ear to ear for telling. He was using the same threat against us, the same emphasis, but his emphasis on why to cut throat to throat was more effective in killing. Okay, and I don't think he knew about the temple stuff, but it was certainly, for me later when I went through the temple, it was traumatic because it brought that stuff back up. And he talked or he also carried around with him razors and switchblades, and that would become important later in his trial too. And so I had Scott, my stepbrother, and then my stepfather, Bill. Bill would use Jesus and Nephi to justify his violence. Okay, and he would, this is kind of the patriarchal authority, the Abraham story, that kind of justification. Scott took the reverse and used Satan to justify him. And so took kind of more of that satanic attitude. And this is, I think, characteristic of some of the 70s type stuff too. I mean, it was part of popular culture, and Ouija boards and stuff were a really big thing in those days. And playing the rock music backwards or whatever and having songs. And those were things that were a big part of the culture at the time. And together though, you got gendered and a racialized world that legitimated abuse. My stepfather was the patriarch. He was in charge. We were to follow. We understood ourselves as white, even with the stories of our Lamanite ancestors, but our whiteness and our masculinity were both precarious. They were something that had to be diligently pursued. It wasn't, you weren't automatically a man, but he would tell you, you need to man up. You need to take it like a man. You need to, this emphasis on our manhood and on our whiteness, or in the terms of going to beat the tar out of you. This was, a way of that racialized and genderized gender violence, and a way of protecting your white manhood in particular. And, he was also, I should say, quite a white nationalist and involved in white nationalist militia movements. So this was an important part of that connection. And the emphasis was always on obedience. You need to obey, obey, obey. And we would hear this at church too. You need to obey, you need to obey. And that's really problematic, right? Because if you're always going to obey, and so if I'm supposed to obey, and the patriarch is my stepfather, when my stepfather's at the temple, the patriarch in the home is my stepbrother, and I'm supposed to obey this guy who's telling me we should go rob our neighbors. And the message that I should just obey. I mean, that really problematic messaging. And I think by talking about this stuff, we can learn to recognize that.
Yeah.
For me, I learned two different ways of being at that time. I learned to be diligently obedient around my stepfather, deference to authority, but delinquent when he wasn't around. And so at that point in my life, I was on a swim team in Burley, and my friends were starting to get these good suntans, and I didn't understand suntanning process. And I wanted to fit in with my friends, and I seemed to not tan as well as other people. And so in my head, I thought, well, if I misbehave, if I break the rules, then I'll turn darker.
Oh, wow.
So I started deliberately misbehaving so I could get a better suntan. I mean, that's, obviously my naivety, but it makes sense if you understand what we were being taught, what we're reading in the Book of Mormon.
Sure.
And what we were hearing from our stepfather, and the idea that obedience creates white men and disobedience creates black men, or dark men anyway, or women, I should say, really, because he would call us wusses. That was when his word, wusses. So anyway, in 1977, we would move to Pocatello, and things would change a little bit at that time. And Scott and Eugene, my stepbrothers, went to live with their mom in Idaho Falls, which I should note is where the Brenda Lafferty is from, right? Or she was Twin Falls. She was Twin Falls, not Idaho Falls. That's right. But I do have relatives in Twin Falls too. And then a few years later, they would join the Army. I began using the name Thomas Bean, and it was eventually adopted by my stepfather because I was embarrassed that I had a different name than my parents, because they would call you Brother Bean, they could Brother Bean, Sister Bean, and then people would be confused. Why isn't my name Bean at church? And so I started using that and then got adopted. And that delinquency that I'd experienced in Burley, which I think might have been partly influenced by my friends, became a rigid obedience in Pocatello. I really became the model Mormon. I became the deacon's quorum president, the teacher's quorum president, the priest, assistant to the bishop, or whatever the title was. All the leadership positions in the youth programs, a scout leader. What do they call the Boy Scout? I don't remember but I was the head of the Boy Scout unit, troop patrol leader or something like that. Senior patrol leader. That's what it was.
Cool.
And So my approach became really that rigid obedience. I dove into books. Books became my life, my escape, if you will. And in some ways, church was also an escape from the abuse at home. And so I think I did have a very positive view of church at the time. And things got rough in our family, especially in 1981, where the economy was kind of tanking, and this time Reagan was coming in and he's laying all these people off and doing all the cutting government spending. Well, if you're in the public sector and hospitals and stuff, that was having trickle-down effects. Not the kind Reagan emphasized that's going to lift you up, but trickle-down effects in terms of my stepfather lost his job because of budget cuts. And he's then trying to find work and looking for different jobs, and it was difficult. Well, that summer, that 1981, Scott, who's now 6'5", I should say that he was actually kind of the runt before, and when in that couple of years when he was living away, and especially when he's in the Army, he just grew 6 inches when he was in the Army, and it kind of a late bloomer that way, but became really tall. And my stepfather was 6'2", so and so Scott, this 6'5" guy, comes walking down the street. I'm out delivering newspapers because I was a newspaper boy. He comes walking down the street and he's really tall, and he's telling a story of getting kicked out of the Army, getting in a fight in a bar, maybe killed somebody, and needing a place to hide. And I went out and finished my paper route. And when we got home, later, I learned that his father had turned him away, saying he wouldn't harbor a fugitive. And so Scott went back to Idaho Falls, where he began stockpiling weapons and dealing drugs. And in October of that year, my stepfather made plans to move our family to Rockland, Idaho, where we were going to live on a farm and off the grid. I was trying to go back to my journals as I was preparing for this and try to figure out what was I saying at the time about my brother and what did I remember at the time. And this is one of the memories that it was there, but I didn't associate it as the same time. So the same month that we learn about this murder, we're getting ready to go live off the grid, kind of like the Laffertys did. And that didn't actually come to fruition. Turned out that situation with the employer at the farm was not quite as feasible as he might have hoped. And so that didn't pan out, but it was interesting that in my journal, the entry that was right at the same time. On October 28th of 1981, my brother Scott Bean and a man by the name of William Caudill murdered a 17-year-old Neil Walker in Idaho Falls. Now, the way I recorded it in my journal, and this is also in the transcripts of the trials, the trial stuff I looked at too, to remind myself, Scott suspected Neil of being a narc, is the term he used, a narcotics agent who might turn him in for dealing drugs. I later interacted with, I was on the debate team in high school, and one of the debate coaches turned out to be one of the prosecutors. She'd worked as one of the assistants in the prosecutor's office, and she recognized my name and asked me if I was any relation to Scott Bean, and I told her yes, I was. And so we got into this long conversation about her role in the prosecutor's office, and she said that she thought there was also a three-way romantic thing going on between them, that this guy Neil Walker had apparently propositioned Scott's girlfriend or something. I never heard that from Scott, but that's what I heard later from her. And again, this is another detail that came out in my journal. I mentioned the cutting the throat. The murder was by slicing the throat. So, very similar to the killing of the baby in the Lafferty family. And he also stabbed him in the chest, and with a razor. Again, he carried that razor around with him around his neck. And my brother Scott, when he was arrested, confessed. And remember, his plan, he told us he was going to kill somebody so that he could become a mercenary, and he thought he'd go to jail for a little while. If he confessed, probably thought that would help get a lighter sentence. And he wasn't ashamed at all of what he'd done. But he's confessed, and of course that came back to haunt him in the trial. And he's eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. So his idea of being in prison for 6 years, that didn't turn out. Life without parole, and in life in Idaho at the time without parole was 20 years. And he later appeals it because he and William Cottle had been tried together, and there were some biases that they thought had got into the process. So he appealed, and later parole would be restored on appeal. He'd get a new sentencing and get parole. But he would serve that life sentence and get out. And he's now in Boise, Idaho. I don't talk to him much at all, really. At his father's funeral, I tried to visit him once in jail, and he told me I was the only one that ever did. The only family member that ever tried to visit him. But they had transported him to Texas for some reason to save money, and so he wasn't in Boise when I was coming through. And kind of sad. Yeah. For me at the time, the publicity around the trial was an incredible embarrassment, especially at school. Now, I was fortunate I didn't have a TV, so I didn't see the coverage on TV, but I was a newspaper boy, and so I read it every day in the newspaper. I followed the story. And I think that probably played a role later in me wanting to change my name back to my birth name, but also the tortured relationship with my stepfather was probably the bigger motivating factor. And for me, church had been a refuge from violence until a seminary teacher in Pocatello kicked a student. And when that happened, I think I reacted by directing my frustration with my family situation towards the church. And so I told my mother I wouldn't go back to seminary until they fired that seminary teacher. What I wanted her to do was get rid of the stepfather, and, so it was an indirect way to say, that's what you need to do. Of course, she didn't do either.
Right.
It didn't advocate on my behalf with the seminary teacher. In fact, defended the seminary teacher. And so I refused to go to seminary, and I would just go sit in the library instead of going to seminary.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Was your mother a victim of domestic violence as well?
That's a really good question. One I've puzzled over this, okay? Because I never saw Bill strike her, okay? However, I did hear fights. So I would be in my room reading, especially in those first years, and I would hear dishes flying, and I would hear yelling and screaming. I don't know if that was accompanied by physical violence. I've wondered, and I never did ask my mom. Someday I want to read her journals and see what she wrote about it. But I can't, whether or not he actually physically struck her, I don't think there's a more abusive thing to do to a mother than to beat her children in front of her. And that probably hurt worse than if he'd hit her. And so, yes, he was abusive to her, but whether or not he actually struck her, I don't know. And, we moved to St. Anthony, Idaho between my junior and senior year of high school. And my senior year of high school, the child abuse had continued, but by now I was, 16 years old and 17 years old. and I could start to defend myself. And it continued until I fought back. And that's part of what I write about in this book, is kind of where this book's, the story here starts, is with I basically had gotten into an argument with my mother and used some words I regret now and the way I addressed her. And she responded by calling my stepfather, and he came and, takes off his glasses and is like, "You want to fight? Well, come on, let's fight," and gets his fists up and starts swinging at me. And so I wrestled him to the ground. I lunged down below his fists and wrestled him to the ground. And I held his face to the ground, and I said, "Look, I can take you now. I don't want to fight. I'm going to let you go, but don't you ever do this to me again." And when I released him, he lunged at me to knock me down the stairs, and would have knocked me down the stairs because we were at the top of the stairs when this happened, if it wasn't for my brother intervening and basically deflecting my falling down the stairs to falling down on the ground. And my brother Greg and I stormed out of the house with them yelling after us, and left. And then, ironically, my stepfather called the sheriff on us for running away after we fought back. And so we got picked up by the deputy as we were walking down the road. We lived out in the country by St. Anthony, by Egan area. And the sheriff deputy, I told him about the abuse. We reported the abuse to the sheriff. And his response is he told us to sleep on it and have a family council in the morning. No idea what the family council meant to us, right? And after one more fight with him, a little while later, over music, having the music on too loud, that's the one and only time I punched him, and it drew blood. It was pretty bad.
And you detailed it in the book. You talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And after that, he wouldn't talk to me. Basically severed our relationship. If he wanted to had something to say to me, he would tell my mom and have her tell me. And it would talk about me in the third person, but would not address me. And I avoided him as much as possible too. And that was just the rest of the year. And I was turning 18. When I turned 18, the rule in the house was you're gone or you pay rent. And I wasn't about to pay rent to him. And as soon as I turned 18, I also changed my surname back to Murphy. I actually started the process before I turned 18, so I was ready to go. And then I moved out on my own and would go to college and so on. And that's the kind of the story I tell here. I tell about meeting Carrie Sumner, my wife. We both bonded over sharing stories of childhood abuse and about Native ancestors. Tell the story of Carrie's suspension from Rick's college and our civil marriage as a form of rebellion. And, for us, we made the promise that we were going to break the cycle of abuse and never use physical punishment on any of our children. We only ended up having one, but, we said we were never going to even spank our children. And that was a promise we made to each other. And we ended up, I ended up dropping out of college. I went to Utah State for the first year, which we're going to be in Logan, Utah, both you and I, in a couple of weeks. So I'll have to show you around a little of Logan if you want.
Oh yeah, please do.
And, but I was only there for a year, and I dropped out, and because Carrie got pregnant. And so I joined the Army, and her pregnancy her due date coincided with my training in the Army. And so we moved back to Davenport, where she was from, Davenport, Iowa. And she stayed with her parents while I was in basic training and advanced individual training. And that's when our daughter was born in 1986. And then the important part of the story I want to share here on this is what happened in the temple. And because that relates to this Under the Banner of Heaven. I know that's a controversial part of the show, is showing the stuff of the temple. And I really struggle over whether I think that's right or wrong, and I'm a mixed emotions on this. Okay. For one, as an anthropologist who's participated in a number of sacred ceremonies with Native people, I would not share the details of those ceremonies with the public. Okay, I respect the privacy, but there is a situation where I would. And that's if a crime was committed, or if it was related to a crime. And that's where the Mormon temple ceremony gets into a difficult situation, because there were oaths of vengeance, of what are called blood oaths. Even when I went through and let's see, when did I go through? 88. I went through in 88, and in 91 they took out the all those cutting your throat and all that stuff. That were basically blood oaths, is the way I learned to describe them. And so I do think when criminal activity is involved, that protection of sacredness has to be compromised, and so I do think in this case, where there is a connection between the temple ceremony and the murder, the murders.
I mean, you could say the same too, even with the William Morgan affair, that perhaps is a tie-in, with
where that actually occurred. I think certainly it's legitimate for the prosecutors to address this in the court. And so then somebody telling the story of the murder, it seems appropriate to address it there. Whether or not you want to show the ceremonies, that maybe that's taking it a little too far, but there needed to be a way to address it. Sure. And that's the way they chose to do it. Now I can understand they probably that's probably got a lot more viewers as a result of it, the controversy.
Absolutely.
So I might have done it a little different, but for me personally, in sharing my story, though, the temple does play an important role, because not only would I get exposed to those bloody oaths that I was asked to make, that were reminiscent, not just of that were, for me, reminiscent of my childhood, where my older brother, who becomes a murderer, is talking about the details of how to kill people, to, by coincidence, have them be similar. So that was traumatic. And the fact that, why would we do that? Why would we as Mormons, vow vengeance or threaten to harm ourselves over obedience and disobedience, or telling or not telling? And it just seemed like a little over the top to me. And so here I'm coming out, because when I went to the ceremony, I did the washings and anointings and the endowment and the temple sealing all in the same day, sequential back to back. And so we'd been in the temple for a few hours, several hours, and our daughter had been in a nursery. And we're in the sealing room to get sealed to our daughter. And they bring her out of the nursery, and she comes in this room and sees some familiar faces, but everybody's dressed in white. And, she sees me and she says, "That's my dad," and kind of excited to see me, and then sees her mom, and she sees her mom, she starts crying. And she starts crying because she was hungry. She was still nursing, and she hadn't nursed in hours. And so she starts to cry, and they try to calm her down, and she just cries more. And so my wife, Carrie, takes her out into the hall, and I thought she was going to nurse her, but she was just going to calm her down. I think in retrospect, she wishes she'd nursed her, but she brings her back in to the room after she'd calmed her down. And then they tell her to come up to the altar, and she sees everybody in white. All of a sudden she starts screaming again. She gets really traumatized and starts screaming. And the officiator tells me, we've got to move on. We've got a schedule to keep. We can't just keep waiting for her to calm down. And he told me, I want you to hold her down. Now, remember that Carrie and I had promised we would never use physical punishment. Is this punishment to hold her down? I think in my mind at the time, I'm like, well, I'm not hitting her. I'm not spanking her. I'm holding her down. But in retrospect, I felt like I violated that promise I made to Carrie, that we would never use physical punishment against our own child. I held her down and she screamed while she was sealed to us for time and eternity. And in my head, Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the altars coming to mind. Here I am in the temple, and I'm being asked to hold my daughter down against her will.
Wow. Yeah.
At the altar. And I did it.
You obeyed.
I did what I was told to do.
Yep.
And then afterwards, the officiator, he says, we wouldn't normally ask you to do that to a child, but this is so important. And I was like, and I thought about that, and that's exactly what's at the root of our violence, right? It's so important that we be obedient. It's so important. Our eternal destiny is at stake. That's the justification that's used for violence. It's so important that Ron and Dan Lafferty can have their polygamous wives, that they're going to knock off Brenda Lafferty and her baby. It's so important. And it really hit me that is what John Krakauer is trying to say about kind of dogmatic religion. And does it cause it? I don't know about that, but it's a powerful justification for those who, for whatever reason, are willing to harm other people.
Yeah. Wow, powerful, man. I read that entry in your book as you just told the story to my audience, and I had to read it. And I was just like, wow, very powerful story that you have to tell, Thomas. And I'm glad that you're sharing this, these deeply personal things, and telling your story, and how the Under the Banner in the Heaven has kind of provided that avenue to have that conversation.
And I do want to kind of wrap this up. This course took longer than I thought it was going to.
Of course, Thomas. It's going to, but that's fine. Yeah. I love it. And my audience loves you.
Yeah, but I want to kind of bring it back to how my view is. There's an important component to this story. There was a period in my life, not long after I had been through the temple, that was kind of like a really big crack in my shelf, as Mormons say.
Yeah.
I started associating Mormonism generally with violence, and religion with violence. So I was thinking very much like John Krakauer is caricatured as doing. And I became that person in terms of blaming religion for everything bad in the world. And everything bad in my world.
And that's really what the new atheists were doing too. Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens were taking the same tack when it came to religion post 9/11.
Yeah, and I did this was before 9/11, but I did this in my own head. But it was actually going to college that changed that. When I went back to college, in particular, I started studying anthropology and religion. And we talked a little bit about this in my other interview with you. So those who are curious can go back to that first interview. And I think you called it an LDS anthropologist becomes an evangelical celebrity.
Yes.
But I talk a little bit about my study of religion and how it really changed my view. And what I'll say here is that a culturally relative approach replaced a worldview of good and evil. And what I mean by a culturally relative, I don't mean that anything goes, but what I mean is that we want to understand religious people in their own perspective. We want to understand cultures in their own perspective, not just an outsider point of view. And the outsider point of views are important, but we want to bring the two together in a more balanced way. And the way I had grown up is that Mormons were good, everyone else was bad. Evangelicals were evil, Mormons were good. Lamanites were evil, Nephites were good. That point of view is so short-sighted, right? And so I rejected it initially by just reversing it. And I see a lot of this still in the ex-Mormon community, is people just reverse it. Now Mormons are all evil and ex-Mormons are good.
Yep.
And I think Dustin Lance Black is trying to be careful not to go there by trying to portray the different views. And I think Lindsay Hansen Park, I think, has been a good influence in this and trying to show the diversity of Mormons. Mormons aren't all the same. We're different. There are pacifists as well as murderers amongst us, just like there is in any other community.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think, is the important thing to emphasize, that it led to a change in my life and perspective by trying not to view the world through the eyes of some people as good and some people as evil. I think all people are complex. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even though I suffered tremendously at the hands of my stepfather, later in life, he apologized.
Really?
So did my mother. It actually took my mother longer to apologize than my stepfather.
Did you forgive him?
And I think so. I mean, I forgave them. Yeah, I still do. I don't harbor judgments. However, it doesn't mean that I wasn't cautious about how my daughter would interact with them. Okay, you know, I'm still going to protect my daughter from their abuses. Even and the thing is, even though my mother apologized to me, I think it's really problematic to me that she didn't do a similar thing with some of my siblings, and that even though I experienced that, some of them never got that, and they continue to suffer as a result of it. They still feel the pain.
Wow. Thomas, appreciate you coming on and talking about all this today. And you know, it's quite a powerful story. And you know, when I said post 9/11, we could also talk about post 9/11 as Mountain Meadows massacre, also informing your view on that as well. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrap things up?
No, I think that's about it. I will say that just as a follow-up to some of our previous interviews, that I'm delighted to learn that a major anthropology journal is going to publish an article I wrote after we talked about we did a critique of the Heartland model on your show. That's now been accepted. I co-authored with a couple of other people, Simon Southerton and Angelo Baca, an article that takes kind of what I said in your show, some additional details and some contributions from Angelo and Simon, and responds to the Heartland model. It's going to be coming out in a major anthropology journal this fall.
Oh, wow.
And maybe we can talk again at that time.
Absolutely, dude.
And I also have an article on the Popol Vuhs, or sometimes called the Popol Vuh, and the Mesoamerican model that's coming out in the Journal of Mormon History this summer. I'll be speaking about that at the Mormon History Association in a couple of weeks in Logan. We'd love to see some of your viewers there. And I know you just did a promo for the MHA. And so I'll be talking about my my Popol Vuh article there. And I will also be talking about that one on the Book of Mormon Perspectives group on July 11th.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
those are
great.
just some upcoming.
Wonderful. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm going to be interviewing in a few days Paul DeBarth, who helped organize the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, which meets every Monday night, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. You're all welcome. I've provided links on my Facebook page as well. And I'm going to be interviewing him because they're doing the I Dig Nauvoo. He's the head archaeologist for it. And so I'm actually planning now to probably, after MHA, I think Rick Bennett and I are going to hop on a plane to St. Louis, and Evangelical Jeff McCullough of Hello Saints is going to pick us up at the airport, and we're going to go up to Nauvoo and maybe do some filming. So it's all very exciting, all that's coming down.
Yeah, I would love to do that dig with him. I've done archaeology digs myself, so I'd love to pitch in one of these times. Probably not this summer though.
Well, it's a great service at Paul DeBarth. He's affiliated with the Community of Christ, and of course, I will be at. Are you going to be at John Whitmer by chance in the fall?
No, I will not.
Okay, well, I'll be there too. I'll be there myself, so look me up there too. So yes, this is the thing. Like I see, I just saw the poster hanging in the back, so I couldn't help but pull this guy out. This is the poster for
right here.
Yep, right there. And that was given to us last year at the end of last year's conference. And Patrick Mason announced the ice cream giveaway, and everybody got all excited. I remember all that. It was great. It was eye-opening just to see that world. Thomas, this was great. I think that we had a very important episode today. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for hosting the show and giving us a chance to talk about these difficult issues.
Yeah. And I love you, man. You're just so awesome. And your wife's an inspiration. And God bless her, man. She's great. So, folks, I just want to remind my audience to don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification button for when a new episode comes out. We're on all the major podcast formats now, so you can now listen to us. About a quarter of the audience now is listening to us via the podcast format. Let's see, Mormon Book Reviews at gmail.com. If you wish to contact me, don't forget the merch store is open. If you wish to support the channel, you can support us financially on both the Patreon or also as well as PayPal. And I do want to thank all my Patreons and PayPal supporters. And of course, now on YouTube, we're generating revenue through ads. So watch some of those ads, because I think I get more money if you watch the ad. I'm not telling you don't watch them, every single one of them, but maybe watch an occasional ad, especially if it's one that's interesting to you, because I do think that helps with the channel too. Either way, y'all have yourself a great day.